Cold Hollow didn't get many newcomers. The mountains were too high, the winters too long, and the work too hard. But on an overcast morning in early spring, a stranger arrived by stagecoach, a woman alone, wrapped in a pale blue shawl and carrying a worn leather trunk. Her name was Anya. The coach driver tipped his hat and muttered something about her being quiet as a snowfall. She stepped down without a word, eyes lowered, lips sealed. The town watched from behind windows and storefronts as she was met by a tall, broad-shouldered man with dust on his boots and a limp in his left leg. Thomas Granger. A man known more for his silence than his hospitality. The widower. The recluse. The man who'd posted a mail-order bride request in the back of a Boston newspaper and never expected an answer. Yet here she was. Their wedding took place the next day, quietly and without celebration. Father Marcel presided. No bridesmaids, no cake, no dancing. Just a vow, a ring, and a kiss on the hand. Anya didn't say a word through it all. Not when she was asked her name, not when the townsfolk offered awkward congratulations afterward. She only nodded, gave a small smile, and looked at Thomas as if she were trying to memorize his face. The silence unsettled people. She mute, asked Hattie Weller, the baker's wife, while kneading dough behind her counter. Or maybe she don't speak English, the blacksmith said. Looks foreign. Eastern maybe. She's hiding something, murmured the sheriff's wife, lowering her voice as if Anya might be listening through the walls. Thomas ignored the talk. He brought her home to the farmhouse at the edge of town, 2 stories. Sturdy wood, surrounded by fields that would soon need planting. He showed her the kitchen, the sewing room, the root cellar, and the bedroom upstairs. He didn't touch her, didn't press her for words. Instead, he said only this: "You're safe here. Talk when you're ready." She nodded. Days passed. Anya rose before dawn, lit the stove, prepared meals with precision and care. She cleaned every corner of the house, even the parts Thomas hadn't touched in years. She tended the garden, joined him in the fields, mended his shirts without being asked. But not a single word escaped her lips. She attended Sunday service and sat in the back pew, hands folded. She walked through town to fetch flour and sugar, paid with exact change, and thanked shopkeepers with a soft smile and a dip of her head. The town grew more curious with each passing day. She's either a saint or a shadow. Someone whispered at church. Children watched her with wide eyes, as if she were a character out of a fairy tale, mysterious, elegant, and haunting. But behind the quietness, there was a story. One no one in Cold Hollow could have imagined. Upstairs, beneath a loose floorboard in the far corner of the bedroom, Anya kept a small wooden box. Inside were letters written in neat, slanted handwriting, all in a language no one around her would understand. Letters she had never sent. Some were to her sister, one was to a man whose name she never dared say aloud, and others were simply written to God or the wind. Folded among the pages was a photograph. 3 people, standing in front of a crumbling stone house. 2 of them smiled. One Anya did not. That night, she sat by the window while Thomas read by the fire. She watched the moonlight dance across the hills and whispered a prayer in her native tongue, words that felt like old wounds. And when she looked back toward her husband, he had fallen asleep, the book still open in his lap. She rose, padded silently to the mantel, and placed one of her unsent letters there. Then she returned to her silence, a silence full of sorrow, secrets, and something else too, waiting for the right moment to break. Cold Hollow was never short on gossip, but since Anya arrived, it had turned into an art form. Whispers slipped between clotheslines and into teacups, across pews and bar counters. The silent bride had become the town's favorite subject, and, with every day that passed without a word from her, the speculation deepened. She understands everything just fine, Hattie Weller insisted, arms folded across her flour-dusted apron. I asked her if she wanted rye or wheat, and she pointed right to the rye. No hesitation. So don't tell me she can't speak. Well, pointing ain't speaking, said Martha Knowles, the school teacher. I've got children who point all day but can't form a sentence to save their lives. Sheriff Alan Delman just shook his head when people brought it up. You don't know what she's seen. People don't go quiet for no reason. But talk was easy. Understanding was not. From her place beside Thomas at church or walking silently down the main road, Anya began to sense it. The change, the way conversations halted when she walked into a room, the sideways glances, the pity, the suspicion. She didn't flinch. She didn't even seem surprised. If anything, she looked like someone who had already lived through worse. And she had. Late at night, When the house was still, and even the crickets quieted, Anya sat by the fireplace with her letters. She didn't read them, she didn't need to. Each one was etched into her memory. They were the only voices she allowed herself to hear now. Her sister's laughter, her mother's lullabies, her own voice, rising in panic that final night, in the village, echoing in the dark. That night she had spoken too much, and it had cost them everything. The next morning, while helping Thomas mend a broken fence post near the orchard, she noticed him watching her. He wasn't a man of many words either, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he didn't say. She met his gaze briefly before returning to her task. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said softly, voice low over the creak of wood and wind. "Whatever happened before, that's not here." She nodded. That was all. She often wondered if he expected her to change, to open like a book left too long on a shelf. But Thomas seemed to live with silence almost as comfortably as she did. He didn't demand her story. He just left space for it. Still, not everyone was so patient. One evening, a group of boys from town dared each other to follow her as she walked home alone from the general store. They didn't do anything, just watched from the edge of the trees, whispered and giggled. But Anya felt their eyes and paused at the crossroads. She turned slowly, looked directly at them, and tilted her head in that eerie, silent way she had. The boys fled like rabbits. By the time she returned home, Thomas was on the porch, sharpening a blade. She didn't tell him what had happened. She didn't need to, but she did something new that night. She reached for paper. The note she handed him over supper was short, written in a delicate, steady hand. "Children followed me today. No harm done. Just watching. They're curious." Thomas read it twice. Then he set it down gently beside his plate. "You don't have to answer this, but do you want to be here?" he asked. Anya looked up from her food. Her eyes didn't waver. She took another slip of paper and wrote, "Wanting is complicated." For a moment, Thomas looked like he might press further, but then he just nodded, as if that answer made sense to him, maybe more than she expected. Meanwhile, the whispers grew louder in town. Why didn't she speak? Was she cursed? Touched? Dangerous? The town had seen its share of oddities. An old trapper who spoke to wolves. A boy who claimed to dream the future, but a beautiful, silent bride was something new. Something unsettling. And then the first strange thing happened. At the edge of old Miller's barn, someone found a circle of stones arranged in a pattern no one recognized. The animals were spooked. One cow was found dead the next morning, its eyes wide open. "Witchcraft," muttered Elias Brandt, the town's most vocal busybody. Or something like it. Of course, someone suggested Anya. She lived on the outskirts. She never spoke. She was foreign. It was enough, but no one said anything to her face. Not yet. They were still watching. Still waiting. What they didn't know was that so was she. 3 weeks after Anya's arrival, the whispers in Cold Hollow began to twist into something darker. Curiosity curdled into fear. Speculation took root like rot in the walls. It began with the livestock. Old Miller, still grumbling about the circle of stones by his barn, woke to find one of his goats disemboweled. No sign of wolves. No signs of a struggle. Just a carcass and strange, charred markings in the grass nearby. The townsfolk gathered at the edge of his property, mouths tight, eyes narrow. "Which signs?" Elias Brandt declared, running his fingers over the burned earth. "Old country stuff. You mark me." By noon, 3 people had mentioned Anya's name, not directly, of course. Just enough for the seed to be planted. "Well, she's different, isn't she? Doesn't go to socials. Doesn't talk. She's not from here?" That evening, Thomas returned from the mill to find Anya standing barefoot on the porch, her dress hem dusted with earth. In her hands, she held a bowl of cool water and a sprig of lavender, both offerings to the dying flowers. On the sill, "You all right?" he asked, setting down his satchel. She nodded, but her eyes told a different story. Thomas sighed. "They're talking, aren't they?" Anya hesitated, then pulled a folded note from her apron. The ink was still wet. "The townspeople are afraid. Something happened last night. They'll come looking for answers." He read it twice, then looked at her. "They won't find any here." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Inside, the house was dim, lit only by the stove and the last of the setting sun. Anya reached beneath the floorboard and removed the wooden box again. She didn't open it, she simply held it in her lap and stared at it, unmoving. In town. The fear began to feed on itself. Mrs. Knowles claimed she'd seen Anya standing perfectly still in the cemetery after sundown, arms outstretched like she was summoning something. The blacksmith's boy swore he'd heard chanting near the chapel on the night of the barn fire. None of them could prove anything, but that hardly mattered anymore. One person started calling her the ghost bride. Another, the spell woman. It didn't help that when people tried to speak to her directly, Anya remained silent, always polite, always calm, but impenetrable. Smiles without voice, eyes that seemed to look through people instead of at them. And then, a child saw her, cry. It was a little girl named Sadie, no more than 7, who came running into her mother's arms one afternoon, sobbing that she'd seen the quiet lady behind the chapel, weeping into her hands. But she didn't make a sound. Mama, not even when she cried. That was worse than screaming. Somehow, as fear grew, so did the tension between Thomas and the town. Friends who once tipped their hats now crossed the road to avoid him. His customers grew scarce. He heard laughter behind closed doors that stopped as he passed, but Thomas didn't back down. Every day, he worked his land. Every night, he brought Anya tea and asked if she wanted to talk, and every time, she shook her head until one morning, something changed. He woke to find her gone, the bed beside him cold, the house silent. For a moment, panic struck him until he found her in the field, standing in the morning mist with her arms wrapped around herself. She handed him a note. I lost my voice in the fire. Not my speech, my voice. I don't know how to trust it anymore. Thomas read it slowly. Then again, you don't have to, he said at last. Not with me. Not until you're ready. But she looked down. Another note appeared, shakier this time. I'm not sure I ever will be. Thomas folded the paper gently. Then we'll learn to live in quiet. That evening, another strange symbol was found carved into the schoolhouse door. Sheriff Del finally called a town meeting. It was time, he said, to decide what to do about the troubles Cold Hollow had been facing. What he didn't say, but everyone knew, was that the meeting was really about her Naen, the silent stranger, the bride who hadn't spoken a word, and yet whose very silence now threatened to tear the town apart. The town hall was packed tighter than usual. The creak of wooden benches echoed with murmurs, and faces twisted with suspicion, anger, and curiosity. Sheriff Alan Delman stood at the front, his usual calm replaced by a sharp tension. The meeting wasn't just about livestock losses or strange symbols anymore. It was about Enya, the mail-order bride, who hadn't said a word since she arrived. Thomas sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her knee. Anya wore the same pale blue shawl she'd arrived in, but tonight there was something different. A quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. People of Cold Hollow, Sheriff Delman began, we've had enough troubles. Fires, missing, animals, strange carvings on doors, ... and now, rumors. Some say it's witchcraft. Some say it's the work of our new stranger. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. I say we find the truth, Elias Brandt called out from the back. No more hiding behind silence and shadows. Anya remained still, her hands folded in her lap. Thomas squeezed her knee reassuringly, but she didn't meet his eyes. Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed, Anya slipped upstairs to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed, pulled the wooden box from beneath the floorboards, and opened it carefully. Inside were folded letters, each sealed with old wax and written in a script no one in Cold Hollow could read. Her fingers trembled as she selected one. The ink had faded, but the words still burned in her mind. A confession. A plea, a story of pain. She had never sent these letters. They were meant for her sister back home, written in the aftermath of a tragedy she couldn't forget. The letter told of a village torn apart by fear and hatred, of families broken by violence, and of a night when Anya spoke up and paid the price. Her voice, once full of hope and laughter, had brought disaster. The village had blamed her for the loss of loved ones. The silence she wore now was both shield and punishment. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry here. Not yet. In the morning, Thomas found her sitting quietly, at the kitchen table, a note in her hand. Without a word, she slid it across to him. My past is a chain. My silence is the key. Thomas read the words twice, then folded the paper gently. He looked at her, searching her eyes for a sign of what to say. Instead, Anya took his hand and led him outside. Together, they walked to the church, where Father Marcel was waiting. Thomas handed him the letter. Father Marcel's face grew solemn. As he read the script, this language ... it is Old Slavic. I learned it in my youth. The priest translated aloud. Anya's letter spoke of betrayal and loss. Of a night when she had raised her voice to stop an injustice, and how that act had cost her everything. It revealed her guilt, her exile, and her desperate hope for a new life. The room was silent. When the translation ended, Thomas squeezed Anya's hand. "She carries a burden heavier than any of us imagined," he said softly. Words spread quickly, through Cold Hollow, and while some townsfolk softened in their judgment, others hardened. That night, Thomas found Anya staring out the window, watching the moonlight dance across the fields. She whispered something in her language, a prayer, a plea, then turned to him. "You believe me?" she finally asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Thomas nodded. "I believe you." For the first time, Anya's silence felt less like a barrier and more like a fragile bridge. One that might someday connect her to the town that had both feared and needed her. But not everyone was ready to listen. Thomas couldn't shake the weight of the translated letter. It revealed a world none of Cold Hollow's residents could imagine, a past steeped in loss and betrayal. A past that explained Anya's silence but also deepened the mystery of her presence. Father Marcel had offered to help more, promising to translate the other letters and bring clarity. But before he could begin, trouble stirred in the shadows. A week after the town meeting, a jagged rock smashed through the grand kitchen window. Tied to it was a note, hastily scrawled in crude English. "Send the witch away before she brings more death." Anya found the shattered glass and the note early in the morning. Her hands trembled, but she didn't cry. She picked up the paper, read it carefully, then, without hesitation, gathered the fragments of glass and swept the floor clean. That same day, whispers escalated into action. A small group of townsfolk, led by Elias Brandt, began to openly conspire. They spoke in low voices about sending Anya away by force if necessary. But Thomas stood firm. "She's part of this town now," he told Elias at the mill. "And I won't let you harm her." The standoff grew tense. Despite the threats, Anya didn't retreat. Instead, she seemed to draw strength from the very hostility that sought to break her. Each morning, she walked to the chapel where Father Marcel served. There, she volunteered, tending to the altar and helping with the choir. Still silent but ever present. The children in town began to notice. Some were drawn to her quiet grace. Others whispered about the ghost bride with fascination. One night, under a silvered sky, Thomas found Anya standing alone by the old oak tree near the chapel. She held a letter in her hands, one she had finally finished writing. She handed it to him without a word. Thomas took it carefully and gave it to Father Marcel. The priest promised to translate it by morning. That night, a violent storm tore through Cold Hollow. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling windows and snapping branches. When dawn broke, the chapel's wooden doors were blackened and charred, the work of fire. Inside, Father Marcel found burn marks on the altar cloth, singed hymnals, and ashes scattered where the choir once practiced. The town was shaken. Fear and anger mingled in heavy clouds. Anya was unharmed, but the message was clear. Someone wanted her gone. Instead of retreating, she walked into the center of town. The very next day, her steps were steady, her head held high. She made no sound, but the silence spoke louder than any shout. People stopped and stared. Mothers clutched their children. Men shifted uneasily. Thomas stayed close behind her, silent but watchful. At the chapel steps, Anya stood tall, holding out the last letter she'd written. She opened it, and, with a voice quiet but clear, spoke her first words in Cold Hollow. "My silence was not weakness, it was protection. I speak now, so you will know who I am, and why I stayed." The crowd was stunned. Some blinked away tears, others looked away in shame. Anya's words wove a tale of survival and sorrow. Of a past she could not change but hoped to leave behind. She spoke of her family, lost to fear and hatred, and of the vow she made to start anew. When she finished, the town was still, as if holding its breath. Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We can build from here," he said softly. Together, the silence that had once defined Anya was broken, and with it, the town's fear began to unravel. After Anya's first spoken words echoed through Cold Hollow, a strange kind of stillness settled over the town. The weight of years of suspicion and fear began to crack, though not without resistance. That evening, at the Granger farmhouse, Thomas and Anya sat by the fire. The room glowing with warmth that wasn't just from the flames. "I never imagined you'd speak," Thomas said softly. Anya smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the flickering light. "I was afraid my voice would bring more pain? Thomas reached for her hand. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. But now, your voice ... it's healing. The next morning, word of Anya's speech spread quickly. Some townsfolk whispered of miracles. Others grumbled about being forced to confront their own fears, but slowly, things began to change. Mrs. Knowles brought Anya fresh bread. Hattie Weller invited her to help in the bakery. Children followed her at a distance, fascinated by the woman who had once been a ghost and was now becoming flesh and blood. One afternoon, Thomas and Anya worked side by side in the fields. As they planted seeds, Anya talked quietly, not just to Thomas, but to the earth and sky. Her voice, though soft, was steady. It carried stories of her homeland, of traditions long forgotten in Cold Hollow. She shared songs and prayers, smiles, and laughter. The townspeople listened from afar, their fear slowly melting into curiosity. But not everyone was ready to forgive. Elias Brandt still whispered to those who would listen, warning of curses and misfortune. The broken windows, the burned chapel, he claimed they were signs that Anya's presence was a danger. One evening, a fire broke out in the granary. Flames swallowed the dry wheat quickly. By the time the fire brigade arrived, much was lost. Suspicion fell heavily on Anya again. Thomas refused to believe she was responsible. He stood by her, even as neighbors turned their backs. That night, Anya wrote a letter, not for her past, but for her future. She gave it to Thomas with a quiet hope. "Trust in me. I will not bring harm." Days later, the letter was pinned to the town bulletin board, signed simply, Anya. The townsfolk read it. Some nodded in understanding. Others scowled. But something remarkable happened. Children who once hid from her began to approach. They asked questions, waited for stories, even sat by her feet as she told tales of distant places. One boy, no older than 10, asked shyly, "Will you teach me to sing your songs?" Anya's eyes shone. "I will." That winter, the town gathered around the fire in the square. Anya sang softly, her voice weaving through the cold air like a warm embrace. The people listened, entranced. Cold Hollow began to heal, and with every song, every word spoken, every small kindness given, the silence that had once defined Anya broke apart, replaced by connection, trust, and hope. The first thaw of spring in Cold Hollow carried more than melting snow, carried a promise. Anya stood at the edge of the orchard, sunlight warming her face as blossoms began to bud. She breathed deeply, savoring the scent of earth and growth, a world so different from the one she had left behind. Behind her, Thomas worked the soil, his strong hands coaxing life from the stubborn ground. Together, they were planting more than crops, they were planting hope. The town had changed since Anya arrived in silence. Fear had given way to curiosity, suspicion to understanding. The strange symbols and burned buildings were no longer whispered about in fearful tones but remembered as part of a difficult past overcome. On market day, the square buzzed with renewed energy. Stalls overflowed with fresh produce, baked goods, and handcrafted wares. And at the heart of it all, Anya's small stand offered herbs and flowers, gifts from her homeland. Healing and fragrant. Children clustered around her, eager to hear stories, sing songs, and learn about the distant lands that once shaped her. Anya's laughter, once absent from the town's air, now filled the spaces between the market calls and footsteps. Old Mrs. Knowles approached, holding out a basket of fresh bread. "For you, dear. Cold Hollow's best." Anya smiled, the warmth in her eyes reflecting the kindness that had slowly seeped into the town's heart. "Thank you." But it wasn't just the town that had changed. Thomas found courage too. Standing beside Anya not just as a protector but as a partner. He had learned that silence could be a fortress. But love was the bridge. One evening, under a sky dusted with stars, Thomas took Anya's hand. "Will you stay?" he asked. Anya looked at him, her voice steady and sure this time. This is home. Now, their wedding, long delayed, was no longer just a private affair. The town gathered, not out of suspicion or fear, but out of celebration. Children danced, neighbors shared food, and the church bells rang with joyful clarity as Anya and Thomas exchanged vows. The past felt distant, and the future stretched wide with possibility. The silence that had once spoken volumes now gave way to the sounds of a community healed and united. Cold Hollow was no longer a place of fear, but of hope, and Anya, the bride who once said nothing, had become its heart.